Before we begin, I have to warn you, this story is not easy to hear. It's painful, it's disturbing, and it reveals a side of reality that most of us prefer to believe doesn't exist, but it did. And what happened to one little boy named Anthony would expose not only the cruelty of those closest to him, but also the failure of an entire system meant to protect him. It all started with a calm 911 call. On the other end of the line, a woman's voice, steady, almost emotionless, tells the dispatcher that her 10-year-old son had fallen, and now he wasn't breathing. The emergency team rushes to the address in Palmdale, California, expecting a simple accident, maybe a child who slipped and hit his head. But when they arrive, what they find inside that house leaves them frozen in silence. The paramedics look down at the small body lying motionless on the floor. Then they look at the mother standing nearby, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Something doesn't add up. The bruises, the marks, the way the child's skin tells a story, the mother's words cannot hide. In that single moment, they realize two terrible truths. First, that the story about a fall is a lie. And second, that what really happened to this child goes far beyond anything they could have imagined. Anthony Avalos was born on May 4th, 2008, in Palmdale, California. From the moment he came into the world, life seemed to test him. His father, Victor, a Mexican citizen, was forced to return to his country soon after Anthony's birth. That meant the little boy grew up seeing his father only through flickering video calls, brief windows where love had to travel through screens and signals. But distance has a way of turning connection into silence. The calls became fewer, then stopped completely. What remained was a very young mother, Heather Barron, trying to raise a baby on her own while still trying to figure out who she was. Heather was barely out of her teens when she became a mother. She worked part-time at a local sandwich shop, barely making enough to survive. Over the years, she moved from one relationship to another, and each time, it seemed to end the same way, with another pregnancy, another child, and another heavy weight added to her already fragile life. By her early 20s, she had 7 children, all living under one crowded roof. To outsiders, Heather appeared constantly exhausted, anxious, and easily irritated. Her friends said she had a short fuse, that even the smallest things could set her off. She would often say that her nerves were shot because of the stress of raising so many kids alone. And maybe, at least in part, that was true. But there was something darker underneath, a growing resentment toward her own children. They became, in her eyes, living reminders of every mistake, every disappointment, every man who walked out and never came back. Yet, despite knowing how overwhelmed she was, Heather kept having more children, as if she believed that one of these men would finally stay, would finally make her life easier. Each time she was left alone again, her anger grew. And soon, that anger found its target not in the mirror, but in her own children. In 2012, when Anthony was only 4 years old, something happened that would scar him forever. Heather often left her children in the care of her father, their grandfather, while she worked or tried to manage her chaotic life. On the surface, it seemed like a reasonable solution. Family helping family. But inside that home, something unspeakable was taking place. One day, a relative noticed disturbing behavior from the grandfather toward Anthony, something that no one could ignore. The relative did the right thing and reported it to Child Protective Services. What they uncovered confirmed the worst fears. The grandfather had acted in ways no adult should toward a child. The Department of Children and Family Services, known as DCFS, opened an investigation. Their findings made it clear that Anthony had been victimized. The logical next step should have been immediate arrest, therapy for the boy, protection from further contact. But that's not what happened. Instead, the agency issued what can only be described as a tragic understatement, a recommendation. They advised Heather not to let her children be around her father, and to take Anthony to see a psychologist. That was it. No charges, no follow-up. The file was closed and shelved, as if a 4-year-old's trauma could be resolved with a promise and a few signatures. And Heather, she didn't keep that promise. Despite everything, she continued to leave the kids with her father from time to time. It was easier, more convenient, and no one from the agency ever checked in. No one asked if Anthony was okay, no one even called. So, like countless other children whose cries go unheard, he carried that wound silently. At school, he began acting out, fighting with other kids, struggling to concentrate. Teachers saw the behavior, but not the pain behind it. To them, it looked like trouble. To anyone looking closer, it was a plea for help. By 2014, Anthony was 6 years old, and the chaos inside Heather's home had only grown. The tension, the shouting, the neglect. All of it had become part of daily life. One day, Heather's sister, Crystal, confided in her therapist about the things she had seen at her sister's house, how the children were being mistreated, how Anthony often looked hungry and afraid. The therapist, bound by law to report suspected abuse, immediately called DCFS again. A new investigation began, this time under the supervision of a senior manager named Mark Millman. When social workers visited the home, they found a scene that spoke for itself. Piles of unwashed clothes, dirty dishes stacked high, the air thick with tension. They noted that Heather seemed impatient and irritable even during the short visits, often snapping at the children in front of the staff. Yet, when questioned, Heather played the role of the exhausted but misunderstood mother. She told them she was overwhelmed, that she was doing her best. With 4 kids already, and a 5th on the way, she said she just needed a little help. But instead of taking decisive action to protect the children, DCFS made a baffling decision. They placed Heather in a voluntary family maintenance program, a light support plan meant for low-risk families. This wasn't a case of low risk. The agency already had records of abuse, neglect, and even sexual assault within that home. Yet somehow, the system labeled it as minor. Why? Because of bureaucracy, because of shortcuts, because acknowledging the truth would mean paperwork, court orders, and real effort. Inside DCFS, a software program existed that could calculate risk based on all available data, past reports, witness statements, and case history. The program flagged Heather's case as high risk, recommending immediate intervention. But Mark Millman and his team overrode it. They marked it low risk anyway. Why? Because it was easier. A low-risk case meant fewer home visits, less documentation, less responsibility. So, once again, the danger went unchecked. Counselors assigned to Heather began to sound alarms, warning that she was becoming increasingly volatile. They reported that she screamed at her children, sometimes even hit them, all while insisting she was trying her best. Their reports piled up, and still, nothing changed. Calls were ignored, emails unanswered. The same system designed to protect Anthony was quietly signing his death warrant through silence and negligence. The professionals who worked with Heather could see disaster coming from miles away. One counselor from the Antelope Valley Children's Center grew so alarmed that she began calling her superiors repeatedly, reporting the danger in Heather's home. But each time she tried to reach Mark Millman, the case manager in charge, she was met with silence. Messages went unanswered. When she finally reached him after weeks of trying, his response was shockingly casual. "I know about the situation, but I believe Heather is trying her best. You shouldn't worry too much about it." That single sentence captured everything wrong with the system. Apathy disguised as professionalism. The staff at the center were horrified. They had witnessed Heather shouting at her children, calling them names, even threatening them, all while social workers stood by. They saw her youngest kids flinch at her voice. They documented everything, sent reports, pleaded for help. Nothing happened. Out of desperation, one counselor decided to bypass the chain of command and call the emergency hotline directly, to report not only Heather, but the DCFS itself for refusing to act. But the cruel irony was that the hotline was run by the same office they were reporting. When Mark Millman found out, instead of investigating, he retaliated. He removed the Antelope Valley Children's Center from the case entirely and transferred the family to a different agency, Hathaway Sycamore's Family Services, effectively silencing the people who cared the most. The new counselor, unaware of the previous reports, started fresh. Heather immediately took advantage of that. She portrayed herself as a victim of unfair treatment and painted her oldest son, Anthony, as the problem, a troublemaker who didn't listen, who made her life hard. The counselor believed her. In her notes, she wrote that Anthony was a whiny, uncooperative child and set simple goals for him. Listen to your mother, do your homework. No one told this new counselor about the previous cases, about the sexual abuse, or the repeated reports of violence. No one warned her that this was a home filled with danger. Within months, Mark Millman officially closed the case, stating that Heather had complied with the program and was showing progress. On paper, the family was healed. In reality, the fire was spreading, and the system had just poured gasoline on it. In 2015, a new man entered Heather's life, Kareem Leyva. To anyone on the outside, he seemed calm, polite, maybe even kind. But Heather's brother, David, who had introduced them, quickly realized his mistake. Kareem wasn't what he appeared to be. Behind that quiet demeanor hid a history of violence, 2 restraining orders, and deep ties to a dangerous California gang. Within months of dating Heather, the first signs of horror began to surface. Anthony's father, Victor, who had been largely absent but still cared deeply for his son, soon learned of bruises and injuries that couldn't be explained. One of Heather's ex-partners also reported that Kareem had been abusive toward the children. A police report was filed. But, just like before, no one followed up. The sheriff's deputy assigned to the case didn't even bother to question Kareem. DCFS received the same report, and still did nothing. Incredibly, instead of reviewing the entire family's case history, DCFS opened a new file for the wrong child, Anthony's 2-year-old brother. The older children, including Anthony, were completely ignored. The investigator assigned to the case, Anna Shortino, later admitted that she didn't review the family's previous reports of abuse. She simply accepted Heather's explanation that the kids fell in the shower. Still, the automated risk assessment system once again flagged the family as high risk and recommended police involvement. But when the report reached the officer in charge, he dismissed it. He had already been reprimanded in the past for neglecting child abuse cases, and he continued the same behavior, signing off reports without proper investigation. Feeling desperate, Heather's brother David and his wife stepped in. They offered to take the children temporarily, hoping to protect them. For a short while, Anthony experienced something close to normal life: safety, warmth, care. He confided in his uncle, telling him about the terrifying things that happened at home. How Kareem would force the children to fight each other, how he would beat Anthony if he didn't obey. David was horrified. He refused to send the children back when Heather came to pick them up. Police were called. The officer who responded saw the fear in the children's eyes and recommended that they not be returned to Heather and Kareem. But DCFS intervened again and decided otherwise. Despite multiple reports from relatives, teachers, and even a police officer, the agency concluded there was no evidence of abuse. The children were forced to go home. As the car pulled away, Anthony's words to his uncle cut deep. "Heather is my old mom now. I'm part of this family. I'll never see her again." It was as if, deep inside, he already knew the truth, that going back meant the end. At his new school, New Vista Middle, Anthony found something he had never truly known before: kindness. His teacher, Ms. Harmony Bell, noticed him almost immediately. He was quiet, thoughtful, always trying to help other students. He loved math, liked drawing superheroes, and smiled whenever she praised him. In her classroom, Anthony finally felt seen. For a few hours each day, he wasn't the unwanted child or the burden. He was simply a boy who wanted to learn. Ms. Bell often stayed after class to talk with him. She said he had the gentlest soul, though there was always something in his eyes, a shadow, a kind of sadness too deep for a child his age. But when he laughed, it was pure and real, like he was borrowing a few moments of light from a world that otherwise offered him only darkness. At the end of the school year, Anthony handed her a letter. The paper was crumpled, his handwriting uneven, but every word was filled with love and innocence. He thanked her for teaching him, called her a blessing, and wrote that he hoped she could come to every school he attended, middle school, high school, even college, so they could keep seeing each other. "I want to stay with you forever," he wrote, "but I know I can't." It was the kind of letter that only a child could write, full of naive hope, unaware of how cruel the world can be. Ms. Bell kept that letter, smiling as she read it, not realizing it would become one of the last things Anthony ever wrote. Because when the school year ended, the door to his safe place closed. Summer began, and with it, Anthony's return to the house that would soon take his life. June 2018, the beginning of summer in Palmdale. For most 10-year-olds, it was a time for rest, laughter, and play. But for Anthony Avalos, it was the beginning of the end. According to Heather's later testimony, the chain of events started over something small: a disagreement about food, or perhaps a moment of defiance. Whatever it was, it ignited something monstrous in both Heather and her boyfriend Kareem. Over the next several days, Anthony endured what prosecutors would later call torture in slow motion. Witnesses and surviving siblings described how Kareem forced Anthony to kneel on rice for hours, beat him with belts and cords, and denied him food and water. He was thrown against walls, locked in his room, humiliated again and again. When Heather was questioned later, she claimed she didn't participate, that Kareem was the one who did everything. But the bruises, the burns, and the patterns of injury told a different story. She had been there, she had watched, and she had done nothing to stop it. On the morning of June 19th, Anthony told his mother he felt dizzy and weak. He asked if he could lie down for a while. Heather said yes. That was the last conscious moment of his short life. Hours later, when she returned to check on him, Anthony was unresponsive. She panicked, or perhaps pretended to, and called 911. Her voice on the call was calm, unnaturally calm. "My son fell," she said. "He's not breathing." Paramedics arrived minutes later, expecting a household accident. What they saw when they entered the home would haunt them forever. Anthony's small body was covered in bruises from head to toe. His skin bore marks of old wounds and fresh ones, burns and cuts. One medic later said, "It was the kind of scene you can't unsee." At the hospital, doctors and nurses fought to save his life, but they all knew the damage was too extensive. When they asked Heather what had happened, she repeated the same story over and over. He just fell. But her words crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The medical staff said it was impossible. No fall could cause what they saw. Meanwhile, Anthony's Uncle David and his wife rushed to the hospital. But even in that moment, Heather made it about herself. She refused to let them in until they apologized for calling DCFS in the past. They did, not because she deserved it, but because they just wanted to see Anthony one last time. On June 21st, 2018, at 10 years old, Anthony Avalos took his final breath. His uncle held his hand until the end. In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by machines and sorrow, the system that had failed him finally woke up, far too late. After Anthony's death, the truth that had been ignored for years could no longer be buried. Heather Barron and her boyfriend, Kareem Leva, were arrested and charged with first-degree murder, along with multiple counts of child abuse and torture. The investigation revealed that Anthony's suffering had lasted far longer than anyone had imagined. Not days, but years of cruelty and neglect. Prosecutors stated that Anthony was routinely beaten, starved, and humiliated, often singled out as the problem child. They alleged that Kareem's rage had grown when Anthony began showing signs of being gentle and kind, traits he cruelly interpreted as feminine. In court, the words, "he said he liked boys," echoed painfully, a phrase prosecutors believed triggered the fatal escalation of violence. The details presented during the trial horrified everyone in the room. Witnesses, including teachers, neighbors, and relatives, described how they had all tried to alert DCFS multiple times. The agency's records confirmed that over 13 separate reports of abuse and neglect had been filed before Anthony's death, 13 cries for help, and not one led to protection. The defense tried to argue that Heather had been manipulated and controlled by Kareem, but prosecutors countered with evidence that she had not only participated in the abuse, but had used her children's suffering for financial gain, continuing to collect government assistance while keeping them in squalor. One of the most haunting testimonies came from Anthony's younger siblings, who spoke through tears about how their brother had tried to protect them, taking beatings that were meant for them, whispering to them at night to be strong. The trial didn't just put two people on the stand, it put the entire system there with them. Journalists and activists compared the case to the earlier tragedy of Gabriel Fernandez, another boy tortured and murdered in Los Angeles County under DCFS supervision. Shockingly, the same key figures appeared in both cases. Mark Millman, the same manager who had ignored warnings, and Barbara Dixon, the counselor who had once been criticized for not having a proper license. Neither had faced consequences after Gabriel's death, and now another child had died under their watch. When the verdict was finally read on March 7, 2023, the courtroom fell silent. The judge found Heather Barron and Kareem Leva guilty of murder and torture. The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many, it didn't feel like justice. Anthony's family, broken but resolute, said that a lifetime behind bars was nothing compared to the years of pain their nephew endured. And to make matters worse, Los Angeles County's new district attorney had previously vowed never to seek the death penalty, meaning neither Heather nor Kareem would ever face that ultimate punishment. In the aftermath, Anthony's relatives filed a civil lawsuit against DCFS, citing gross negligence and systemic failure. The county settled for $32 million, one of the largest child protection settlements in U.S. history. But money could not buy back a single heartbeat, a single smile, or a single chance at the life Anthony never got to live. Anthony Avalos' story did not end with the prison sentences or the settlement. It became something much larger, a symbol of how deeply broken a system can be when bureaucracy replaces humanity. His name now stands alongside others: Gabriel Fernandez, Noah Quattro, children who died not because help wasn't available, but because those responsible for protecting them chose not to act. Each of their stories follows the same haunting pattern: warnings ignored, reports misplaced, red flags buried under paperwork. And behind every failure lies the same quiet, deadly assumption that someone else will handle it. For the public, the outrage was immediate. How could a child be seen by so many teachers, counselors, and social workers, and yet still die this way? How could names like Mark Millman and Barbara Dixon reappear across multiple child deaths without accountability? The answers were both simple and devastating. The people who were supposed to protect Anthony had stopped seeing him as a person. To them, he was just another case file, another checkmark on a form. But amid the anger, there were glimmers of hope. The teachers who had loved Anthony, the counselors who had risked their jobs to sound the alarm, and the relatives who never stopped fighting. They became the voices for change. They demanded reforms, new oversight, and public transparency. Slowly, the county began to review the procedures that had allowed this tragedy to happen. Yet for many, those efforts felt like too little, too late. Anthony was gone, and no policy could bring him back. Still, his story carries a message that cannot be forgotten. It reminds us that the first step to saving a child's life is not a law or a program. It's awareness. It's noticing when something feels wrong and refusing to look away. When a child seems frightened, isolated, or hungry, when their eyes tell a story their words cannot, that's the moment to act. One phone call, one report, one small act of courage could mean the difference between life and death. Anthony Avalos should have been starting middle school that summer. He should have been making new friends, playing soccer, dreaming about his future. Instead, his name became a warning, a plea to every adult who ever suspects that something isn't right. Don't wait. Don't doubt yourself. Don't assume someone else will make the call. Because the truth is, you might be the only voice a silent child has left. And perhaps that's the legacy Anthony leaves behind. Not only the pain of what happened to him, but the hope that his story will awaken others to act, to protect, and to care. If even one person chooses to intervene because they remember his name, then in some small way, his light still lives on.